I'm Chris Stevenson, and this is part 3 of 5 of our video series on mechanics and character creation in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. The first 2 videos in this series covered general topics and then attributes. The next 2 videos will cover disciplines and then advantages and disadvantages. This video is about skills. Here, I'm going to give some overall suggestions, then go over all of the skills in the order that they're listed on the character sheet. Skills vary drastically in their general utility. There are some skills that are helpful for almost all characters with some frequency. And there are other skills that a character will never be called upon to roll unless the character's specific concept is doing that thing. You can watch the introductory video for a broader discussion of dice pools, but in general, if your concept involves being good at something, I would suggest aiming for at least 6 dice in your relevant pool. In deciding on the appropriate number of skill dots, you can largely ignore the flavor descriptions for the different dot levels given in the V5 core book because they simply do not line up with how the mechanics work. For example, based on the flavor descriptions, Intelligence 3 and Academics 3 would be the appropriate stats for a very smart, but not genius level person with a doctorate in the subject. Based on that description, you would think that this person would routinely be able to accomplish difficult tasks in their specialty field. But rolling 6 dice won't even get you 4 successes most of the time. So aim for big dice pools, don't worry about what those flavor descriptions say. When deciding what skills might apply to what you want your character to do, you might want to examine the specialties listed. Also, make sure to check out Appendix 1 standard feats in the core book when trying to assess what skills a character might need for certain activities. The information back there is more detailed than the descriptions in the main text of the core book. Note that the information in that appendix is not always consistent with the main text. In general, where there is a conflict, I would go first with the appendix, then the skill description itself, and only then with an example elsewhere in the text. That's essentially the differing levels of utility you get out of that. For example, architecture is a specialty of the academic skill, and the appendix discusses using academics architecture to design a building. So I would recommend ignoring the example in the book that calls for a craft architecture roll. So, last thing before we get into the detailed descriptions, if you are not sure where to put your skill dots after selecting the ones necessary for your character concept, consider taking the following: Awareness, Brawl, Subterfuge, Streetwise, Persuasion, and Insight if your storyteller does rolls for you to read other characters. Other generically strong skills include Firearms, Larceny, Intimidation, and Technology, but those first ones I listed, hard to go wrong with them if you've got a few extra dots and you're not sure what to do with them. Right, on to the list. First, the physical skills start off with athletics. Athletics, depending on how your storyteller does things, can be of surprisingly little use in a game of Vampire. There can be a lot of physical action in Vampire, but a lot of that is combat, which does not use athletics except for dodging. And if you remember my discussion of combat, you really shouldn't be dodging very much. It's a losing strategy most of the time. So the question in assessing whether or not athletics is going to be good is how often you think there is going to be that non-combat related physical activity. If you have a foot chase, that's probably going to be athletics. If you have to roll because you're climbing up buildings in a way that goes beyond just a normal break-in roll, then it might come up, but it's something that can be very variable depending on the storyteller. I tend to have it rolled a bit more, but a lot of storytellers it's not going to come up. Next on the physical side is Brawl. Along with Awareness, Brawl is one of the 2 most important skills in the game. Vampires will get physically violent with each other at times, and they will certainly get physically violent with mortals. A lot. Brawl is the most likely skill to be used in these confrontations. Sure, there's more damage to be had if someone is preparing for a fight They're carrying around their katana or a machine gun. But fists are always available, and they attract a lot less attention than firearms. And not having a decent strength plus brawl roll can mean an embarrassing inability to accomplish simple tasks like grab that witness before they run away. Being bad at brawl cuts your character off from being able to feed using the alley cat method when needed. And it can turn what's supposed to be a terrifying anger frenzy into a pathetic mess, as your character is readily flattened by the target of their fury, instead of doing something interesting like mauling their best friend. Consider the consequences before entirely ignoring brawl. Craft generally involves physically constructing things, whether practical or artistic. This will be a central skill for some character concepts, but these are things which most characters will go an entire chronicle without ever doing, despite the wide breadth of real-world tasks covered by this skill. If you take craft, don't forget your free specialty. Note that intelligence might be called upon for the design aspects of craft, not just a physical attribute roll appropriate for the actual construction. Drive. Unlike in prior editions of Vampire, you don't need to buy drive just to be able to drive a car or just to be able to use a stick. Note that drive rolls will be more often based on wits than dexterity. Again, how much this comes up may depend on the storyteller. Storyteller's usually not going to have you make drive rolls just to drive from point A to point B. It's when you get in chases or other confrontations involving a vehicle that this would usually come up. Firearms. Vampire is a violent game. A lot of character types who might never touch a gun as mortals will end up wanting one in Vampire. Firearms also has the advantage of being primarily based on composure. This is a generally useful attribute anyway, and this can make firearms handy for characters who aren't focused on the physical attributes suited for melee combat. Larceny. Larceny is not nearly as broadly useful as Streetwise, but, much like Firearms, it comes up a lot more for characters in a vampire game than it does for most mortals. Note that, although Larceny is grouped with the physical skills, it is probably most often going to be rolled with intelligence, because so much of security is electronic, and because the physical act of sneaking is stealth, not larceny. Larceny is also the skill for setting up security, which will, again, typically be intelligence-based. Next on the physical list is melee. Overall, a combination of Brawl and Firearms is generally more useful than melee. It's just a lot easier to conceal a pistol, and you never have to conceal your fists. And in the world of darkness, characters usually don't have to worry that much about pesky things like gun safety laws or forensic firearms analysis. But if you want to be that loner with the sword under their trench coat, or something less stereotypical, melee is what you'll need. Melee is also used with more modern weapons, such as baseball bats, tire irons, or tactical batons, the sort of things that are much less likely to draw attention than a longsword. Stealth. Stealth is less commonly rolled than you might think. This is partly true because of obfuscate. If a vampire character concept involves being very sneaky, then the player usually takes the discipline of obfuscate, and most storytellers won't make characters roll stealth to stay quiet once obfuscate is activated, although that can be an option. Note that sneaking around can be very all or nothing, so this is a skill where, if you want to be good at it, you might want to make sure you're very good at it. The standard roll to oppose stealth is wits plus awareness. Those are two pretty universally effective stats to have. So you kind of have to assume that there will always be someone competent around to oppose your stealth check. And it is often the case that when you sneak, you want to be very sure that you're actually going to be stealthy, not just a coin flip. So stealth might be more of a take a lot of it or don't bother than most skills. The last skill in the physical column is survival. Survival does have urban applications such as hiding bodies, but Vampire is typically an urban game, which really limits the applications of survival. Now, onto the social column. Animal Ken. I guess you can take Animal Ken if you're a farmer predator, but you don't have the right animalism to summon your snacks? Etiquette. There's something more useful. Etiquette can be a handy skill for group social situations. If you're in one of my games, you might find yourself rolling etiquette because I think that social situations should involve dice, and I use etiquette as a way of assessing what sort of impression characters are making on NPCs. However, it's very easy for potential etiquette rolls to be swallowed by more active skills like Subterfuge or Persuasion. And some storytellers don't use rolls at all for the sort of casual social impressions that etiquette can cover. So, very much a your mileage may vary. Insight. Insight is the skill used to read other people, and in the social world of the kindred, it can be a vital skill if your storyteller makes you roll for such things. The more your game involves you, the player, assessing credibility and motivations, rather than the character assessing them through dice rolls, the less useful insight gets, to the point that it is almost useless with some storytellers. Intimidation. Like Firearms and Larceny, Intimidation is narrow, but it is narrow in a space where Vampire often plays. Sure, you may catch more flies with honey than vinegar, but more often than you might think, the one fly you need to catch right this very second really only responds to vinegar. Intimidation is very unlikely to be as broadly useful as something like Subterfuge or Persuasion, but it is unlikely to be wasted. Leadership. A prince or a baron might need a high leadership score to keep their throne, but your character probably isn't a prince. And while the coterie might have a leader, it's highly unlikely that the group's leader will be called upon to see how well they are leading the other player characters. This makes leadership one of the skills that may never be rolled, unless your character's concept specifically plays into it. You're some sort of mob-leading rabble-rouser, perhaps. Performance covers any sort of live artistic presentation, be it dancing, singing, or reciting poetry. And don't forget your free specialty. Like craft, performance covers a vast breadth of real-world abilities. Also like craft, they are the sort of thing that might never come up for most characters. However, performance can include public speaking, which a character might be called upon to do whether they like it or not. Persuasion. Persuasion might be the go-to social skill, except vampires lie all the time about a lot of things, and that's covered by Subterfuge. Still, Persuasion covers a lot of ground. And unlike some of the other social skills, Persuasion covers ground that's relatively likely to call for a roll, such as negotiation or other places where there is a very concrete objective for the social interaction. Note that although the book lists fast talk as a specialty of Persuasion, that's wrong. It's actually part of Subterfuge. Next up in the social column is Streetwise. Streetwise can be omnipresent in a vampire chronicle because vampires so often become embedded in the underworld. Drugs, blood bags, unregistered firearms, people who don't want to be found. All of that's Streetwise. Even most tracking is Streetwise. Sorry, Survival. It's hard to go wrong taking Streetwise. Subterfuge. Rounding out our social column and completing our trifecta of extremely useful social skills in a row is Subterfuge. The sneaky partner to Persuasion, Subterfuge comes up whenever you move from just playing on someone's emotions to flat out lying. Did I mention that vampires lie a lot? It's used in Siren Predator pools, which is one of the more common hunting styles. Also, Subterfuge is one of the few skills that can be used to resist some discipline powers. On to the mental column, with Academics. This is the third of 4 extremely broad, free specialty granting skills that still probably isn't all that useful unless it's specifically part of your character concept. It's the sort of thing one might think should be slapped on the vast majority of characters because they went to high school, which theoretically is what one dot in academics represents. But your storyteller is probably never, ever, ever going to ask you to do a role to represent whether or not you have a high school level of academic knowledge. So, awareness. Awareness is the most common skill used to notice something, which is pretty much always important for all characters at all times. It might be as omnipresent as spot checks or perception checks in some other games, but it's still going to get rolled a lot. It's hard to go wrong putting dots in awareness, and it would be the first skill I would look at if I had some extra dots. Ventru have an extra reason to take awareness, as it is part of their role to determine whether a mortal meets their feeding restrictions. Finance. I suppose it says something about how much money matters, and how important the concept of Ventru corporate overlords is, that going to business school gets its own skill when getting every sort of PhD in the world is dumped into academics. Still, finance is usually only useful if your character is running a business, actively engaged in stock trading, maybe trying to cook the books, that sort of thing. Investigation. Investigating things is a pretty common activity in a lot of role-playing games, and it's the sort of thing that's highly likely to come up in a game of Vampire. However, the value of the investigation skill in a particular game can vary depending on the storyteller. Is spotting a clue investigation, or is it awareness? Is figuring out cause of death investigation, or is it medicine? Is locating a missing person investigation, or is it Streetwise? Is using a database investigation, or is it technology? Obviously, one set of answers to those questions makes investigation much more useful than the other set of answers. Additionally, where there are two possibly applicable skills, some storytellers, including me sometimes, will let the player use which one they want, which is a scenario that makes investigation very strong because it's often got some tangential relevance. If you have a storyteller like that, there's a very good chance that investigation will be very handy. Speaking of medicine, it's not typically something that's needed unless your character concept is a doctor, a nurse, an EMT, what have you. Don't get me wrong, mortals will get hurt all of the time in your games, but there's a good chance that your characters were the ones hurting them, and you can't heal other vampires with medicine. It's possible for medicine to be very high leverage when it comes up. Maybe your touchstone took a bullet for you, but even then, it's more used for stabilizing someone until they get to a hospital, not for having your vampire perform surgery. Occult. Occult can be incredibly useful or pretty useless, depending on the themes of your chronicle and your storyteller's opinions on what vampires should know about the world around them. When a chronicle includes appearances by other sorts of supernatural creatures, Gehenna myths, or vampiric history, and your storyteller limits character knowledge of those sorts of things, then occult will be vital. Even if you don't roll occult, your storyteller may still look at your occult dots as a way to determine what general information your character might know in a way that's probably less likely than with other skills. On the other hand, if your chronicle focuses mostly on modern topics, or if your storyteller assumes that all vampires have at least a passing knowledge of things like the Book of Nod, then occult is unlikely to come up. Politics. Politics is more likely to be relevant than occult, and also more likely to be ignored by the storyteller. Politics is somewhat the ability to engage in politics, but kindred politics are typically so personal that persuasion or subterfuge is going to be called for. There just aren't enough vampires to make a faceless bureaucracy. And messing with mortal politics can also be handled through influence. Politics is also somewhat just knowing about the political situation. But I'm not sure how many storytellers will make characters roll politics to have a grasp of the local kindred power structure. It's usually either you know it as general background information, or it's the sort of thing you have to find out personally. All of these factors make politics a highly relevant concept in vampire games, but make the politics skill itself of less value. Science joins academics and similar skills in covering a really broad area of knowledge, most of which will never come up in a game of Vampire. On the more practical side of things, science is used to create explosives with a technology or craft follow-up to actually build your bomb. So there's one practical application if you want to up the damage level in your game. If you do take science, don't forget your free specialty. Finally, there's technology. Because it used to be different in prior versions of Vampire, let me note that not having technology does not mean that a character is unable to perform basic tasks on a computer. However, unlike its compatriot Drive, there is an awful lot that can be done with technology. This is true even keeping in mind that hacking is not magic, and that a lot of hacking is about tricking people to give you access. In fact, if your storyteller is overgenerous, technology is a skill that can overwhelm a game, given how tech-dependent and interconnected modern life is. Especially because there's a good chance that characters will be carrying smartphones and using the internet regardless of the Camarilla's recent commands on the subject. Even with the more appropriate and limited use of the technology skill, the skill can go far. And it can be helpful for gathering information, tracking people, circumventing security, and making sure that others can't do those things to you. Well, that's all of the specific skills. To sum up, if there's some activity you want your character to be good at, make sure to load up on the applicable skill dots. However, keep in mind that skills are generally not relevant for discipline use. If you've selected the skills needed for your character concept, and you have a few left over that you aren't sure what to do with, there are a few skills to consider. Awareness and Brawl cover important game activities that almost every character will have to deal with at some point. Similarly, vampires get involved in criminal activity a lot, and Streetwise can go a long way. On the social front, Subterfuge, Persuasion, and to the extent your storyteller makes you roll it, Insight are go-to skills. That's it for this episode. Stay tuned for 4 and 5, which will cover disciplines and then advantages and disadvantages. If you found this useful, please like this video or subscribe below. Thanks.